welcome everyone and good morning to those in Southeast Asia, and good afternoon for those who are in Hawaii, and good evening for those who are in the East Coast of America. This is the last webinar for LuceSEA Southeast Asia in Transition with the webinar titled Climate Change Migration in Southeast Asia. On behalf of the University of Hawaii, Manoa Center for Southeast Asia Studies team, I would like to welcome you all to this event. My name is Supet Chan. I am currently an instructor at the University of Kentucky Geography Department in America, and I will be the moderator for the session today. And it is my honor to be with you all. And the format today will be, first, I will introduce the speaker. And second, we will have our speaker give a presentation about their work. The third session will be a Q&A that hosted by myself, the moderator, and then the last section will be a Q&A from the audience. So we're very honored to have three speakers today. First, we have Ms. Melinda Martinus, is the lead researcher in the Climate Change in Southeast Asia program and the Asian Studies Center in ISIS. Her research interests involve around sustainable development, smart city initiative, digitalization, institutional framework, and the policy for advancing climate ambitions in Asian countries. Melinda is production editor in ISIS magazine, the Asian Focus. She co-edited the Institute's two annual survey report, the State of Southeast Asia Survey and the Southeast Asia Climate Outlook. Our second speaker is Dr. Carl Middleton. He's an associate professor and the director of graduate studies in the International Development Studies program, and the director of the Center for Social Development Studies in the Faculty of Political Science at Chulalongkorn University, Thailand. He has helped establish and now lead the Chulalongkorn University UNESCO chairs on resource governance and the future literacy. Dr. Carr's research interest oriented around the politics and the policies of environment in Southeast Asia, with a particular focus on human in nature relations. And finally, we have Dr. Mokbul Morshed Ahmad. Is a professor in development planning, management, and innovations in the School of Environment, Resource, and Development, Asia Institute of Technology. Prior to that, he was an assistant professor in the Department of Geography and Environment, Dhaka University, Dhaka, Bangladesh. He holds a PhD in Development Geography from Durham University, UK. Thank you very much, and we will start with the second session. We will start with our speaker who give presentation about their work and how it linked to climate change migration in Southeast Asia. So we start with Melinda. Please go ahead and share your work. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sophia. First and foremost, I would like to express my gratitude to the Center for Southeast Asian Studies at the University of Hawaii Manoa for inviting me here to this webinar. My name is Melinda Martinus. I'm a lead researcher at the Climate Change in Southeast Asia program at the ISIS Yusof Ishak Institute based in Singapore. My research focuses on climate governance in ASEAN countries. But in addition to my research, I am involved in producing the Southeast Asia Climate Outlook Survey. It's an annual exercise of our institute that tries to measure climate awareness and attitudes of Southeast Asian citizens. To our knowledge, our survey is the first comprehensive annual survey specific to the Southeast Asian region, and it's about climate awareness of the region. Since its inception in 2020, the survey has tracked public perceptions on a wide range of issues, such as climate impacts and policy perceptions, with key themes like climate adaptation, energy transition, food security, and international cooperation. Maybe you can move to the next slide, please. Yeah, this is the survey. Our survey doesn't serve as I would say, a predictive kind of or something that can measure, uh, uh, can predict something in the future, but it serves as a barometer of sentiments towards climate action for policymakers, businesses, and other stakeholders. Please allow me to share some highlights from this year's finding. Next slide, please. For the context, the survey is divided thematically. If you download the report, you can see the sections of the survey. The first one is respondents profile. The second one is realities versus expectations in Southeast Asia's climate future. The third one is climate transition issues. And the last one is climate leadership and cooperation. Next slide, please. Yeah, this is a brief introduction about how we conduct our survey. The survey was conducted online from July 10 to August 7 this year and included around 39 questions. A total of more than 2,200 self-identified Southeast Asian respondents from all ASEAN member states participated in the survey. To broaden the survey's reach, it was available in 6 regional languages and ensure sample representativeness across nationality, gender, age, socioeconomic status, and so on. We applied country population size and age demographic weightings to ensure the representativeness of regional responses. Now let's delve into some of the findings of the survey. Next slide. So usually in our survey, we ask our respondents since 2021, we ask these questions, how they perception on their government, how they feel their government in responding to climate issues. Compared to 2021, now more Southeast Asian respondents have a positive view of their government response to climate change. But across countries, we find some diversities. This year, Singapore and Vietnam respondents were the most approving of their governments, while Philippines respondents were the most disapproving. Next slide. Floods, heat waves, and landslides are the top 3 climate impacts experienced by Southeast Asians. Interestingly, this year, landslides replace drought as a major concern. But we should note that the region's diverse geography explains the variations in experiences. For example, the Philippines is most concerned with tropical storms and floods, probably due to its location in the cyclone path. Meanwhile, country like Singapore, for instance, is concerned with heat waves and sea level rise, probably due to its geographic characteristic of being in low-lying island. The next slide, the next highlight is in regards to of viewing climate crisis and willingness to take action. We asked our respondents on a scale 0 to 8 how they feel about the future of climate crisis. Almost 60% of Southeast Asians believe that their lives will be greatly affected by climate change in the next 10 years. Across the region, respondents from the Philippines, again, are more likely to experience impacts firsthand, which corroborates with current lived experience. Conversely, at the regional average, around 2% believe that they are not going to experience impacts in 10 years. The largest cohort of of the respondents choosing these options are coming from Brunei, Cambodia, and Laos. And in regards to taking action, lifestyle changes for sustainability are common, although declining this year. For example, a majority of respondents reported reducing single-use plastics and electricity consumption, though these practices have declined compared to last year. We also find a quite interesting pattern here. Urban residents are more likely to adopt to this lifestyle adjustment compared to rural respondents. Next slide. Now, another interesting highlight is that food security, we find that it has worsened in our region, as highlighted in our survey. The majority of regional respondents reported experiencing greater food insecurity this year compared to last year. For those of us who follow climate change issue quite closely, we probably realize that probably this perception is shaped by the impact of 2023 to 2024 El Nino, which is reported the strongest across the years, and it has intensified the problem by causing droughts and crop failures across the region. Probably this is why our respondents strongly felt that they experience food insecurity. The next highlight I like to share here is in regards of a little bit geopolitics here. We try to understand how Southeast Asian feel about international cooperation. We ask our respondents which country or region has demonstrated a leadership in climate innovation, such as renewable energy, green building, and so on. Japan remains the region's top choice for global climate innovation leadership. But interestingly, the US now has surpassed the EU to secure the second position, showing significant growth in recognition. But the EU is now ranked third. So those are probably the highlights I like to share for now. I'm happy to discuss this further and also discuss the intersection between climate change and migration issues in the discussion session. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Melinda, for these fascinating and very informative surveys. And I have learned a lot about the perceptions and the impacts and how people understand climate change across Southeast Asia. Now we move to the second speaker, Mokbul. Please go ahead and share your research. And yeah, thank you.
Let me share my slides. Just a minute. Yeah. Sorry. Good morning from here in Bangkok. I am Mokbul Ahmad. I am as Sophia. Thank you very much. So as just introduced me, I am a faculty member here in AIT, Asian Institute of Technology. I mostly teach and research in international development, NGOs, and adaptation to climate change. So it's an honor to present my some of the recent works on particularly focused on migration and Southeast Asia related areas on climate change, particularly adaptation issues. So I mean, I think you have already heard from Melinda about the work, wonderful work they have been doing. I will be mostly sharing some of my recent works, and particularly some of them are ongoing, but I mostly will talk about how that the debate looks like, and perhaps it will look like in the coming years and perhaps decades, because all of us know how climate is changing and how it is affecting us. I think, I mean, I'll start with the main, I think, some of the broad picture. Maybe to save time, I'll mostly go to some of the recent works people have done, and then I'll move on to my own work, some of the own work I've been doing on the way we have found that particularly community members think about the climate change and particularly displacement and migration. all of us know that it is now clear that the effects of climate change are seen in many ways. One of them is, of course, displacement. People are supposed to move, and particularly the way sea level is rising, the way the Southeast Asia particularly is urbanizing. It is now very important to understand how the cities will change, how the cities will look like, and at the same time, who will be living in those cities and how they will make their living. And of course, finally, the issue of at least to ensure the basic services for these people. Actually, this is one of the major issues. And one of the issues I have been working on in the last few years, mostly the last 2-3 years, is the issue of the locating the displaces, which I mean end up in my final minute in my presentation. What exactly is, as I told you, the case of the drivers. All of us know, I think, the issue of the climate change and particularly drought or drought-like situation. Because I think why I've been using this, I'm sorry to say that, because when we talk with government people in this in a number of countries, they sometimes mostly ask the question that they have their own definition of drought. But actually, when we talk to community members, they talk about drought. So I think it's very important to to mention to you that what exactly is the perception of the community members, because they feel that things are getting worse in terms of particularly the issue of water, the drought-like situation. Because as I told you, that there is official definition. Until then, governments don't announce the issue of drought. And another issue is the issue of extreme weather events, which I think ranges from, which I think Melinda has already started mentioning, the case of cyclones, heat waves. And this is one of the issues I prefer to highlight, because I have almost finished work on the urban heating in some Southeast Asian cities, which includes Kuala Lumpur, Manila, and Jakarta, and of course Bangkok. So we try to see with some Australian partners, we try to see how the urban hotspots look like, and what is the difference between the hotspots and other places. And I must tell you, the initial findings are quite worrying, which says that the many of the places which are not hotspots are very close to hotspots in terms of temperature trend. So this is a bit worrying to all of us, and we should be worried about that, because how the future will look like if the current trend continues. So why exactly is the issue is very important for us. First is, I think, as a key focus of our discussion today, is the issue of migration. Now, the main question is, how do we address the issue of migration? Who are the people who have been forced, or who have been had no choice, so they have moved? So some people call it distress migration. So you cannot continue your livelihood there, so you move. But second question to us is the issue of what is the number. That is a big question. I think it is an important issue, and I think all of you are aware of particularly the work by IPCC, because we have a number of colleagues and we have interaction with the IPCC, and at the same time people working for IPCC. So I think it's a question to all of us, how many, but let us skip the debate. It is now clear that many people are forced to leave. They are, forced to leave their place, and where are they going? Second question is, what is the changes in the livelihood of these people, how they are, and how they look like compared to others. For example, one question I will request you to consider. So it's a big question that people are displaced. Usually, I'm sorry to say that, we mostly feel that people displaced by conflict. But what is the comparison between this group of people who are displaced due to conflicts and who are displaced because of climate change related, I'd say, stressors? So this is very important questions for all of us. And some people are already arguing, probably the people who are displaced because of climate change, they are more compared to those who are displaced mostly due to war and conflicts. This is very important. So it's important to understand that how this will look like. First is the issue of how do we see these movements? How do we track those movements? How do we address them? At the same time, is the issue of how the places where they have moved, they will look like, and these people, particularly vulnerable population, how they will make their living, particularly their livelihood issues, will be very important. So we probably have some immediate issues to. The broad debate is now. I think there are a number of challenges for us. If you allow me to sum up what exactly. I have been discovering in my recent works. One is very important to understand the track, and at the same time, I repeat, at the same time to understand. Where are they moving? And is it rising? And is there a variation, as Melinda has started discussing, across the countries in Southeast Asia? There is a variation, and that has to be analyzed. Perhaps there should be a study. Second is what can we do rather than sitting idle? If sorry for using this word. The issue is, of course, first one, I don't think I have to elaborate, but the point is how these countries, the policymakers, are taking those issues, particularly the public sector, the non-profit organizations, NGOs, and civil society organizations. And at the same time, how business is reacting to it at the same time. But I think, as all of us know about the current debate on climate change, and particularly global talk, which just finished, one which we have annually now, see somewhere in the world, all of us, I think, are aware how the global climate talk happened in Azerbaijan. So probably, in short, we need two things immediately. One is a finance, and finally, there is a need for a political will to deal with that issue, particularly the climate change and its effects, mostly visible through displacement and migration. I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mokbul, for this very insightful and sharing the concern and debate around climate change, not just where they come from and what happened there, it's also where they're going and what a city would look like with the climate change pressure and stress, and also what can the government and other relevant agency do to tackle the issues. And now we move to Carl. Please go ahead and share your talk.
Thanks very much, Sophia. I hope that you can hear me okay. Okay, great. Thank you.
Yes, we can hear you.
Great, thank you very much. I'll share my slides. So first of all, thanks so much for the invitation to join this panel. I'm already learning a lot from the other two panelists. My name is Carl Middleton. I think Sophia has already introduced me very well. My research is on broadly environmental politics in Southeast Asia, especially taking a political ecology approach. I'm also, increasingly find myself working on the relationship between human mobility and environmental change or climate change, simply because it's such an emerging issue in the region. And I'm especially interested in ideas of environmental justice and mobility justice or climate justice as well in relation to those topics. So I'll briefly outline some of the work that we've been doing at the Center for Social Development Studies. We have a small team in the Faculty of Political Science and regularly collaborate with other organizations to co-produce research together. So let me briefly introduce some of that research. I think that the work that kind of made us, as a research group, first kind of more and more aware about the relationship between mobility and environmental change was this study that we undertook shortly after the serious flooding in Thailand in 2011. So we produced this edited volume that's titled Living with Floods in a Mobile Southeast Asia that includes 8 country case studies. And I'll just briefly summarize some of the findings. So I think it's kind of relevant to where we are now in the discussion on human mobility and climate change. So in this research, one of the things that we started with was recognizing that there's a long history of mobility in Southeast Asia and also a long history of living with floods. And there are many different types of floods in Southeast Asia, some of which are beneficial and some of which are harmful to different groups. So there are floods like seasonal floodplain inundation or flash floods that might occur in urban areas or mountain areas. And the key thing to take away from this was that we need to complicate narratives of the relationship between environmental change and mobility, that not all environmental changes are harmful, like sometimes they can be beneficial. So another important, I'll expand on this in a minute. Another important finding that we had was that people's risks or vulnerabilities to flooding also reflects a longer term context of socioeconomic and political inequality. So for example, destructive floods disproportionately affect marginalized groups from lower socioeconomic groups and with less political power. But also we identified case studies where institutionalized disaster responses actually redistribute risk from one group to another. And often this is also shaped by long-term development policies. So in essence, it led to a viewpoint on thinking about human mobility and environmental change or climate change as being at the intersection of environmental change and socially produced outcomes. Like whether we're talking about disaster preparedness and response, or we're talking about longer term development practices and economic growth, they all shape current present day human mobility and the risks that people experience in terms of climate change and environmental change. We also found a number of cases where like people who move often get blamed for living in risky places, rather than trying to understand the wider context as to why there is migration in the region. And that can sometimes lead to policies that regulate movement and reinforce vulnerabilities rather than address them. So I think this book is especially relevant to questions about adaptation, because, and I'll discuss actually another side of mobility, human mobility and climate change, which relates to mitigation as well later. But mostly, I think human migration in response to climate change is framed as adaptation, and flooding is one of those examples. I put some QR codes here to the CSDS website for those that might be interested. I'll briefly now introduce a couple of other studies. Just in the interest of time, I'll be necessarily brief. A second study that we did more recently, and this is, I mean, tragically relevant at the present day as well because of flooding in Hat Yai at this time. We undertook a study about flooding and state responses in Hat Yai, and this was in collaboration with the Raoul Wallenberg Institute, and we're interested in taking a human rights-based approach to understanding these issues. So actually, over the past couple of decades, Hat Yai has experienced a number of major flooding, and the state's response and non-state actors' response has kind of shifted as lessons have been learned over time. So in very brief summary, the early responses were mainly infrastructural, either trying to build infrastructure through the city or later build a big canal to kind of allow water to go around the city. And whilst it reduced risk to a degree, it also didn't fully address the risks of flooding in the city. And so then what became known as the Hat Yai model emerged after 2010 that also introduced a lot more community-based planning, like so-called soft approaches, so community risk management and so on. So in all of this, the types of displacement that are experienced, some of it is immediate, like when flooding occurs, and there's also a kind of choice not to move as well. Like when flooding happens, then people may stay in place because they're concerned about the security of their possessions or prefer not to move. But then also as infrastructure has been developed in response to managing these environmental changes like flooding, it also leads to displacement as well. So we were interested in this study to emphasizing how the human rights-based approach to responding to being prepared for subsequent floods would be an appropriate method. More recently, there's a couple of studies that we have ongoing, and I think this first one speaks a little to what Mokbul was discussing. We've been undertaking a study in Samuprakan in Kunsamutchin. It's quite well known in Thailand. That's the case where there's this temple that has been protected whilst land has been lost to the sea, partly due to sea level rise, but also partly due to, or even more so due to coastal erosion and land sinking. So we take this as a case study of managed retreat. So one of the responses to climate change in coastal areas is to either stay in place or to retreat, where retreating is an example of displacement of migration, but very short-term migration. And then it raises important questions about the policies of the state in managing this. The name managed retreat implies that it will be managed, but in the case that we're looking here, we actually find that it's quite difficult for the communities to access fully the resources that they need from the state. It's rather piecemeal and kind of constrained by the administrative and bureaucratic arrangements that exist. And the community itself has also been very proactive in managing to try and stay in place. So it leads us to we identify different adaptation pathways of either migration or staying in place. And it raises important questions about the accountability between state policies and people affected, where importantly, although this connects to climate mobility, a lot of the issues at stake are far more about land rights and housing rights and access to other state resources.
Where's my Christmas tree?
The last study that I'll just briefly mention is one that's ongoing in collaboration with the East-West Centre. We think that this study is a very timely study. It's looking at the relationship between climate change, agrarian change, and conflict for migration between Myanmar and Thailand. In this study, we're especially seeking to learn from migrants who have moved from Myanmar to Thailand, especially in Bangkok, and to understand the circumstances and outcomes of their migration. I can share a little bit more on this in a minute. In the subsequent questions. Aside from this, I just mentioned that I think an important part of addressing these issues is also about. Sorry, Athena. 1 second. Sorry, it's Father's Day today in Thailand, and my daughter's here. The final point I want to make is that it's important to promote the issue of climate change and migration. So we've been organising events such as this one. And producing policy briefs to translate our research into public information. And we hope to continue doing this too. So thank you very much for this initial opportunity to share information, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Carl, for bringing the climate change migration into this complex socio-ecological relation and also relationship with the state, but also political ecology approach to climate change and migrations. Now we can move to the second session, which is we have some prepared questions, and each speaker will answer all the questions one at a time, and I will post. So the question number one is, could you share insight from your experience and research on how climate change intersects with migration? I understand that our speaker have briefly talked about their work on migration, but can you please sort of give a little bit more of your kind of insight into how that intersection more complex or relating to one another? Please, we start with Melinda, and then Carl, and then Mokbul.
Thanks, Sophia. As you see in our survey, for now, our survey has not really talked about climate adaptation that much. We measure climate awareness and also a lot of climate mitigation issues like energy transition, just transition, and so on. We haven't really talked about disaster issues that much. But yes, I think that's something we need to focus in the future. It would be interesting to see how public perception surrounding climate disasters is perceived in Southeast Asia. But based on my experience doing research in Southeast Asia and also my previous career in Indonesia, in Jakarta, there are at least two big trends to understand the intersection between climate change and migration. The first one is Mokbul already elaborated this very much, the issues surrounding climate-induced displacement. climate disasters such as rising sea levels, extreme weather events, flooding are already displacing a lot of coastal and riverine communities across Southeast Asia. Low-lying countries like Vietnam, Myanmar, and the Philippines are especially vulnerable. We've seen a disastrous event happening 10 years ago when Typhoon Haiyan displaced over 4 million people in the Philippines. So that's the issue surrounding climate-induced displacement. And the second one I like to highlight is from my previous work in Indonesia, facilitating city governments to think about their climate adaptation strategies. It's about rural and urban migration. It's very interesting and very relevant for the Southeast Asian regions because I think climate impacts, especially on agriculture, such as droughts, unpredictable rainfall, really push rural population to search for new livelihoods in urban areas. But sometimes when they move to the urban areas, they also live in dangerous areas like near the river banks or in coastal areas. So these people, they sometimes experience twice climate disasters when they were in their hometown, in their in rural areas. But after they move to urban areas, they also experience this. So it's very interesting to see how the urban and rural migration dynamics happening. This is a very common issue for, I believe, cities like Bangkok and also my hometown Jakarta.
Right.
I'll stop
Thank you,
that
Melinda.
there. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, it's very interesting to see they move from climate change impact to another space that's also prone to climate change. There's not a lot of study to look at that as well. Very fascinating. And the second would go to Carl, please.
Okay, thanks very much. So I guess in the first part, I've already introduced some of the studies that we're undertaking on climate change and migration. Melinda's already also mapped out the significance of this to Southeast Asia. Maybe one thing that I'd want to highlight that I think is an important area of work to be done is also the conceptual approach that kind of migration studies and understanding climate change, especially through a political ecology lens, have often been a little distant. But over the last 5 or 10 years, there's starting to be more dialogue between migration studies and understanding environmental change and its consequences, including climate change. So I think this is an important direction for our work, and also hopefully for others that are involved in this issue. That in migration studies, the early approach was basically to understand environmental change, which would include climate change, as essentially just a push factor, rather than seeing it as a kind of cross-cutting issue. So more recent environmental research has started to see mobility as a part of people's adaptation strategy, where the decision to migrate and the process and the outcomes are kind of a complex interaction of cultural and demographic and economic and political and social outcomes. So I think this work is important because it leads to more nuance and understanding how environmental change connects to migration. But I think also the other way around, that those that focus more onto political ecologies of the environment in Southeast Asia, which kind of draws out the power relations involved in who can access resources and who can't, who can make a living, and how climate change affects that, would also benefit from more it's often kind of case study based research is in place. So I think political ecology can also learn from migration studies about the implications of mobility. Because one of the insights of migration studies is that things are multi-sited. There's where people come from, there's where people go, there's how they get there, and it's relational. The outcomes in the host location and the outcomes in the home are interconnected. They connect through remittance flows from the distributing of risk and so on. So I think this is an important piece of work to be done that will help us further our understanding of location-specific climate change and migration. This is something maybe I want to discuss more when we talk about policy. But the importance of like situating mobility and climate change in Southeast Asia is very important, I think, rather than just thinking of the global scale picture. Thanks, Sophia.
Thank you, Carl. I really like the political ecology approach. It also kind of reveal this complex and also the some sort of agency people have in terms of movings and the sort of intimate everyday relationship with ecologies, and not just ecology is not just a backdrop of climate change. They also interact in everyday basis. We move to Mokbul. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much. Maybe if you allow me, I will take a more like a community-based, approach here, but a focused approach sorry. What I'm trying to say is that I think to me, what we are seeing in the recent, in our recent work is like that. Let me be very specific. That in many cases, particularly in the vulnerable areas and the vulnerable communities, we are seeing these very common cases that people complain about, for example, issue of water. That you struggle to get the safe water. You struggle to manage water for your farm, for your, to run your farm. So what you do? You try your best or try more and more to manage safer water for, from drinking to domestic use, and then of course your farm. Now, how much you can do, how much you can, I think there are two cases. One, some groups, I'd say some community members and communities are still struggling, but some community members, I'll put the community member because let me update you on that. What we have discovered that in many cases, when we do our field work, we see that in this family, the man has moved to Yangon, moved to the city, particularly Bangkok, for example. The reason is for more income, for a better livelihood, because you cannot continue here, you cannot make a living. So if you want to run, continue children's education, even the basic things of your family, you move somewhere at least. So one thing, it is very clearly happening. That is very important. Secondly, these issues are, for example, that the struggle that you do, for example, managing safe water. And of course, the new technologies are coming. I must tell you that, it involves people like me checking rainwater harvesting, all those issues. But you see, the problem is, first thing is it needs investment. You need to put your money for that, and it needs maintenance. At the same time, finally, it needs a sustained effort to manage these services, particularly, for example, rainwater harvesting and other, for example, ponds and filter, for example. I'm sure some of you know that are used now as technology. Some donors and governments are also trying to popularize it. Now, the problem is that how many community members or communities are able to benefit from that. If you can't, I think, this has to be explored. Many of the community members, if not the whole family, as I told you, some members are simply moving to another place because it's not possible to continue there. Just to try to sum up, if I can, the issue of to manage the basic things, you need to manage more money to have some basic things ensured, from drinking water to say for example, to manage education cost for your children. So you have to move. Now the question is two things to me. One is to see the effects, the way of, for example, salinity is affecting the people's access to basic things like water. Secondly, is the issue of the interventions. What interventions are being made, particularly in the particular context, coastal area, dry areas, or drier areas of the province, of the district, have to be identified. And there are more needs. And if it is not understood, and if it is not addressed, I think this migration will continue. And finally, I think it's very important to understand how it is happening, who is moving, and where are they moving. So these things are very important. We need to know these drivers, at the same time, the consequences, particularly at the community level. Yeah, I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mokbul. I think it's get back to Carl's question about the political ecology, the power dynamic that involve who have access to waters beyond technology, beyond the the intervention, what are the power dynamics involved with at the community, at the finer scale of community interactions. So we're hoping to discuss more on that. And so we move to the second questions is what are some of the conceptual and practical challenges to understand the relationship between slow onset environmental change, including climate change, and human mobility / migration? We start with Carl and then move to Mokbul and then Melinda. Please, Carl.
Okay, thanks, Sophia. I mean, this follows on nicely from the discussion that we've just been having. I mean, probably the starting point, I would say, is to recognize that climate change and human migration or human mobility, depending on how we want to understand it, is really moving up the policy agenda. There's a lot of international funding and international organizations studying this nowadays. So in other words, both in terms of policy and academic research and in terms of also media discourses, there's a lot more compared to 10 or 15 years ago. But there's still actually also kind of ambiguity about what climate migration actually is. And I think this question is relevant to that. So how do we identify a climate migrant, especially in the context of slow changes, like trends rather than shocks, so to speak? So in one level, like terminology matters, because we have to have terminology in order to translate like the issue into law and policy action. But then in the process of creating rather blunt definitions, we lose some of the nuance, which is relevant to this question of slow onset changes. So some of the more immediate disasters, like the big disasters, like floods and droughts and typhoons, create immediate like emergency displacement or forced displacement that are generally at present addressed under kind of disaster preparedness laws in the region. Whereas the issue of slower trends in environmental change, like gradually changing seasons, the growing prevalence of dryness or the changing hydrological systems, are not really being recognized at present. So this is both, therefore, a conceptual and a practical challenge. Let me just give a very brief example of Tonle Sap Lake, which is, I've been working around Tonle Sap Lake with fishing farming communities for a while there to kind of demonstrate the complexity of slow onset change. So I'm sure that many of the participants know that Tonle Sap Lake is the largest freshwater lake in Southeast Asia and connected to the Mekong River. Within its floodplains, about over 1 million live directly in the floodplains, and far more live in the wider basin, who are both fishers and farmers and fisher farmers. So obviously the lake itself is changing in terms of the fishing livelihoods and the farming livelihoods, but there's a kind of relationship between flooding and livelihoods. So when the lake floods seasonally, reflecting the monsoonal characteristics of the region. So when there's regular flooding, the floods support the fishery and they also support agriculture. Whilst when there's high floods, then it is beneficial for fishers because there's more fish, but it affects farmers because they can't practice their regular cropping, and infrastructure is also destroyed, and livestock can also be harmed. Conversely, when there's low flows, like there have been a number of times now since 2019, the drought both affects fishers and farmers. Farmers do not have enough water to practice their farming, but also the lack of flooding means that it's more difficult to manage pests and weeds in the dry season. Whereas for fishers, the lack of water reduces the fish catch, in essence. So one of the responses of people living around the lake is when livelihoods are difficult, to migrate away, either to migrate within Cambodia or to migrate across borders to Thailand or beyond. So an important question is, well, to what extent is climate change shaping the changing environment around Tonle Sap? And to what extent are other factors, such as large hydropower dam construction or other kind of development initiatives like changing land use in the wider basin, affecting people's livelihoods in the changing environment. So I think this case study kind of reveals the complexity of thinking about slow onset environmental change and mobility, where the main challenge is how do you identify the climate change part of the change from a wider array of other development trends that are happening in the region. And that's relevant both in terms of thinking about policy. Is it wider development policy that we need to think about, or specifically climate mobility policy? It's also relevant in terms of mobility justice and finance, because Mokbul already mentioned about the COP29. One of the really important issues being discussed is loss and damage. So how do we attribute climate change's role to these impacts in a location like Cambodia, and therefore channel resources towards supporting the impacts on livelihoods, where climate mobility is one response. So I'll leave it there. Hopefully that at least problematizes the question and suggests some policy directions. Thanks.
Thanks, Carl. I would like to I studied on this as well, and I studied displacement, just contribute this sort of, my argument is sort of that not an event-centric kind of approach to climate change or migration is kind of limited. So sort of look at the agency of water and how water kind of shape migration. So that's kind of my kind of contribution to the conversation. Thank you very much. So let's move to Mokbul. Please go ahead.
Thanks, Sophia, and also thanks to my colleagues. I think I prefer to, focus on issue which I think I prefer to, is quite relevant for our discussion, if you allow me. What we have discovered, particularly the recent work with parts of Malaysia and parts of Thailand, is the work we did with partners. The slow onsetting disasters, say for example, the case of salinity, there are many implications. Just to focus on, if I try to highlight that, we try to see the health issues. We thought mostly that it mostly affects, for example, that people, salinity, I think all of us know, salinity has a number of very well-known health effects. But what we discovered, I prefer to go into that. We have discovered that a number of issues, people sometimes fail to understand that it is not because of aging, not because of other factors. There is another factor here, is the higher salinity. For example, the case of particularly among women, the case of the issue of the bone-related orthopedic challenges. So some doctors told me, I must admit that I was during the field work, I discovered that they told me that if you are very much for example, if you are a sheep farmer, if you work in the farm, we are with the water for longer time, particularly for women, there are certain things, gynecological issues will come up, and they will be more frequent, they'll be more severe, given the particular gender, particular age group, and particular vulnerable group who are longer in those situations. And all of us know who are those people do that. One, mostly almost unpaid family members, and of course, wage workers. We hire, and sometimes it is the people who are poor because of the higher need for these people to get contract or seasonal jobs. They work, and they sometimes they do not take protective gears. They do not use protective gears, and in most cases they do not understand the health effects of working longer in those situations. As I told you, the case of salt or high level of saline water, if you work longer in those, for example, in the sheep farm, is a good example. That has to be understood. And if you consume water, if you do not know very well, there is a level, and if you are beyond that, if you keep on consuming that year after year, month after month, there are certain health effects which will be happening. This may not be because of aging, because of other drivers. So it is, in most cases, probably, I think there should be more detailed studies, more aggravated because of the climate-related effects. For example, salinity, as I told you. Another issue is the issue of the heat wave, as you can see here, particularly the construction worker, which we are trying to do that because the first phase is over by partner organizations. If you see The way during the heat waves, the measures taken, the forecast, for example, the issue of the time of the day, which will be very extreme. If you can avoid that, you can drink more water. All those measures we know. But if you see on the ground, you will discover that many of them know that, but they cannot do that because there is a time mentioned. You have to work from this time to this time. You have to do this. This is how you are paid. This is how the contract looks like. Contract works like that. So if we see the link between these drivers, slow onsetting events, and particularly the most vulnerable groups, I think we should try to get a very close link between that. Secondly, which I started, the issue of health effects. I think this is an area which I think analyzed much more in detail, because we usually have a feeling that there are certain diseases, I think all of us know, non-communicable diseases. Many of them are very much because of certain factors, lifestyle, all those factors we know. I think time has come to admit that, or try to explore very carefully the link between this type of factors like salinity, higher heat on the effects of health, and particularly the diseases. And finally, awareness and dealing with them. I think, these have to be explored immediately to understand and of course, to address them. I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you for bringing in this intersection of different factors that climate change affect people's health. Melinda, please go ahead.
Yeah, I think I do agree with Carl earlier mentioning that usually, a sudden shock, climate disaster shocks like typhoon, usually it does prompt governments to respond quickly. Usually, it's all about disaster responses or humanitarian issues. Usually they look at look at it from that lens. But if we talk about the slow onset climate change issues, such as changing weather patterns or sea level rise, I think the policy responses often look at the broader development issues. For instance, in my home country, Indonesia, we are concerned with the declining of the middle class population because the country is aiming to achieve its high income status by 2045. So the country focused so much on poverty reduction. So the development ministry, they are very concerned with this climate change issue. For instance, climate disasters like flood affecting urban population, it can prompt these people to go back to poverty again. Every time this sudden shock happens, it creates vulnerability for this population to return back to poverty again after they attain their middle income status. So it's something that we need to look at, a broader development kind of policy, especially the interlinkage with poverty alleviation. But I think a lot of countries in Southeast Asia, they already started to think about whether, you mentioned earlier, Carl, about whether to look at it from development policy angle to tackle this slow onset issue, or look at it from the climate migration policy perspective. I think they try to combine it actually. So for instance, policies like social protections targeted at disaster victims. It's happening already in the Philippines. I think some localities in the Philippines or some groups in the Philippines who are experiencing sudden shock, climate disaster shock, they definitely can get support from the government. The government will provide social protection schemes. In Indonesia, it's also very interesting law. I think it was passed, the bill was passed a couple years ago on the protection of people with disability caused by climate disaster. Not climate disaster, but disaster. So for those of them who become disabled due to climate disasters or disaster, other types of disasters, they must be taken care by the states. So I think those kind of policies are becoming much more nuanced now. It's a combination between a development policy and also humanitarian policy. Yeah.
Thank you, Melinda, for bringing this. Also, there's a different approach of the solution to climate change policy approach, development and migrations policy. We move to the third question. How do you see the intersection between conflict, climate change, migration, displacement in Southeast Asia countries? We start with Carl, Melinda, and Mokbul. Please, Carl.
Okay, thanks, Sophia. So again, yeah, this will pick up on some of the topics that we've just been discussing. I think probably I'd start by just briefly saying, well, there's many, in the way that we're trying to approach a political ecology of climate change and mobility, then there are also many different types of conflicts as well. Some are very visible, like direct violence, whilst other forms of conflict emerge from structural violence or slow processes of violence, and so kind of create slower burning conflict, but also with impacts on communities. So I'll just briefly comment on each. I won't address so much conflict in destination places. Maybe some of the other panelists will address that. So I mean, I guess in terms of direct violence, at least in mainland Southeast Asia, the most obvious example of this at present is the 2021 coup in Myanmar and the consequences for hundreds of thousands of people's livelihoods as a result. So I mentioned earlier that we have one project. This is in collaboration with the East-West Centre. On the East-West Centre side, it's with Kevin Woods, who's worked in Myanmar for a long time. So we're trying to bring together the changes in Myanmar with how it shapes migration as a kind of driver and an outcome, I guess. And we also have a postdoctoral student researching on this. So after the 2021 coup, there's been different forms of displacement. Some of it is internal displacement, creating internally displaced people like IDPs. And some of it is international migration, moving across the borders to India or to Thailand. There are millions of migrants from Myanmar who work in Thailand. So I guess the way I want to frame this is that climate change intersects with other things that are happening, like other types of conflicts. That already we could say, first of all, that migration in response to conflict in Myanmar is multifaceted. So one direct connection would be the fear or the actual experience of violence, including by the Myanmar military towards those involved in the civil disobedience movement or the PDF, and also different ethnic people and the ethnic armed organizations. But there's also a wider economic consequence of the coup in Myanmar too, which is making people's livelihoods increasingly difficult. And often one common explanation of migration is economic reasons, like economically driven migration. So conflict connects to the economic circumstances. But then there are other policy issues as well. So for example, the recent conscription law that is also pushing younger people away from Myanmar, even after the coup. So how does climate change intersect with that? So in the context where livelihoods, especially rural livelihoods, are already becoming more difficult, climate change can exacerbate the impacts of conflict. So for example, climate change's impacts on migration for those that are working in agriculture. So we're kind of in the process of documenting these connections at the moment, and please look out for the studies that will be coming out shortly with Kevin and others. I have some other examples, but in the interest of time, I won't share them for this. I just want to also then flag kind of longer term structural violences, such as the impacts of large dams. So this is where I also want to connect climate change policy, not just in terms of adaptation, but also mitigation. So large hydropower dams are often framed as being a climate solution, like a technology to reduce carbon emissions. In the Mekong Basin, there are about maybe 100 medium and large scale dams that have been constructed over the past 3 decades. And how does that relate to, so in other words, climate policy is one part of the justification for this energy policy direction. But this, large dams also connect to different forms of displacement and migration. So the obvious example is resettlement or forced displacement due to the infrastructure itself. Range of studies showing the consequences of this type of displacement in terms of the process, like the consultation, and also the outcomes for livelihoods. But surprisingly, the actual numbers of people who have been displaced by large dams have not been systematically documented in the Mekong, but each project normally entails between hundreds and thousands of people moving directly. But then there's also like a slow forced displacement as well. We could use that way of thinking. So in other words, the impact of large dams onto the wider hydrology and ecosystems creates more difficulties for people who are resource dependent. So I mean, that connects to the case study I mentioned earlier in Tonle Sap at a distance. But then also there's already existing academic studies that have documented out-migration from southern Laos in the Cone Fall area, from central Laos on the Hin Bun River, and also from the Mun River in northeast Thailand, where the Pak Mun Dam was built. You know, so this is where the kind of slow onset changes that are kind of slow violence creating conflict have also created migration. And then lastly, and just very briefly, I know in the interest of time, that there are also emergency displacements as well when there are dam breaks. So fortunately, these are not too common in the region, but they do occur. For example, the ZPNZ Nam Noi project in southern Laos in 2018 that resulted in at least 49 people dead and 22 missing, and the displacement of 4,500 people. So although the current situation is not so clear, as studies were being undertaken, at least as of 3 years after the dam collapse, over 100 families were still in temporary housing. So in other words, this is another form of displacement that indirectly, but does connect to climate policy through energy policy. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Carl. Melinda, please.
I don't think I have a lot to add to that, but I can relate with what Carl mentioned earlier I think in a lot of climate discussions, there is a theme called maladaptive response, which is like how your strategies to adapt to climate change is actually causing a lot of harm to the population itself. It's happening, I think, in the urban context, because in my previous work, I work a lot with urban governments. In my hometown, for instance, Jakarta, the government of Jakarta was aiming to build a giant seawall to protect the city from big flooding, right? But in expense of that massive grand scale infrastructural project, the fishermen communities living in the north part of Jakarta must be displaced. So it's causing a lot of tensions between the city government and the local population. And there are some instances as well, I think elsewhere, where actually our response to climate change can actually create a lot of conflict. In development term, we call it this maladaptive response.
Melinda, you done? Or you?
Yeah, I'm done.
Okay, Mokbul, please go ahead. That's also your favorite questions.
Thanks, Sophia. And I will I'm afraid I also mostly repeat some of the issues Carl has very wonderfully raised. And I think my experience, or I say my insight, is very close to most of them. Actually, let me explain in this way. I think one of the major implications is at the very local level, when you have more scarcity, particularly for basic things, and of course on livelihood, what do? Immediately, I mean, you face more conflicts because the resources have become scarcer, obviously. So there are issues here, and there are cases, I think many cases, where conflicts have aggravated in the local level. So what actually is also we are happening, we're seeing that now, is the case of for example, Myanmar has already been rightly pointed out, particularly two phases, if you allow me. One is the before the coup, recent coup, and another is the after the recent coup. And the consequences are like that, as I think Carl has rightly pointed out, that many of them have moved, and I think there are officially more than 3 million Myanmar workers working in Thailand at this moment. I'm sure the number is much more higher. But I think, I'm sorry to say, many people do not understand how the particularly Myanmar case has affected the whole region to a large extent. It goes beyond, for example, around 1 million moved to west, to Bangladesh, mostly the Rohingyas. At the same time, a large number of them. And because another issue is the issue of the legal structure, because some of the countries have not signed the Refugee Convention. So if you go to a place when the country has not signed those agreements, there are implications. So there are issues, and just going back to our recent experience is that some Thai NGOs are struggling with the stateless people in Thailand, because many of them are simply, largely they are stateless people because they do not have any document. Now, how to deal with that? So this is one implication. So we are seeing those, consequences across, within countries and beyond countries. Now, is it because of climate change? Probably it is aggravated by climate change, if not fully because of climate change. As I think Carl has rightly pointed out, when particularly in the recent coup, as a close witness, I can tell you the public services has rapidly declined in most parts of Myanmar. So you cannot keep, continue there. You have to move. You try to move somewhere. So what to do? Within the country, or you go beyond the country? As I've just told, that the Highlands, for example, if you look at Thai-Myanmar border areas, you can see the changes, the tension. At the same time, the worries that both the groups of people, including the government people, are facing, and above all, the NGOs are saying that, because more people to serve, so more resources are needed. How to manage those? And there is dissatisfaction that I'm supposed to get that, I'm not getting it. So so all those things create tension, dissatisfaction among the clients, if I can use this word for these people. Now, how to understand that? How to understand two things: the drivers and the effects on the key stakeholders, like government agencies, and particularly the case of NGOs. Let me go one by one. The issue is the understanding the number, I think, which has rightly been pointed out. Difficult to understand the number. Only we mostly talk about a particular area, and when you talk to government people, I'll be very frank with you. Officially, government people will never admit that. Very sensible. They cannot do that, but they know, because they are the people on the ground. They deal with people, so they are the right people to know about it. So the number is important, but many of them, I think, and actually it has also increased crime and corruption also. So these all have all the consequences on all of us. We are all affected by that. And of course, finally, the labor market, the way wages have changed, the way labor availability, labor situation has changed. Now, if we see the issues of the broader issues, the governments are now, when you have a conflict, if it is within your country, and if you have a conflict, just close to your border, your next neighboring country, you are immediately affected by that. You need to understand, you need to deal with that. And then there are issues, I think all of us know very well. There are approaches bilateral, there are approaches multilateral. Now, if we see the conflicts, now we see a number of conflicts have remained unresolved, and some of them have become long-drawn conflicts in this region. So Myanmar is perhaps a good example to analyze. And I hope somebody will analyze those very carefully. And it is very complicated in terms of, I repeat, if you move around Thailand, you will discover how one part of Thailand, for example, Bangkok, is showing one of the, if you go detail, and if you go north of Thailand, Chiang Mai, for example, you will see some certain ethnic group refugees almost are, some of them are, in one place, almost living like one community there. And they are, treated by government in a way that the government wants them to be in one place. So they do not have much choice to go for a higher wages and long-term work opportunities, because they are restrained in a particular area, sometimes look like camp or something like that. So we are seeing all those effects, sometimes short run, sometimes long run. But how do we deal with that? I'll sum up with the issue. to understand the causality, at the same time to address those with a long-term vision so that it is addressed and it does not happen again in that part of the world and also in other parts of the world, including for example, in a local level to a regional level also. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Mokbul. I think we have 15 minutes for the last session for the Q&A. We have quite a few questions. And the first question from Catherine Diamond to Melinda. Certainly the response are different from urban to rural respondent as much as between the different countries. Can you answer that?
Yeah, I think that's a question that we're looking at this time because we have a solid 5-year data. We want to make it more methodologically sound. So we try to analyze it comprehensively now. But I can share with you the results maybe after the launch of our 5-year report survey. But I think in Western society, there is a tendency, at least the discourse is, if we look at the situation in the United States, there is a discourse that tries to differentiate between how the rural people and the urban population differ in their view, in their regards, their awareness on climate change in the States, because there is a political discussion surrounding, conservative and also the liberal living in urban areas, the conservative living in rural areas. The tendency is that the rural population, they tend to be more conservative. They are mostly climate deniers, but the urban population, they're liberal and more willing to do more for climate change. But so far, we don't find that trend in Southeast Asia. I think both urban and rural population can elaborate the impacts of climate change quite significantly between urban and rural population. We don't have that kind of distinction yet, but I want to study it further and want to make our data more comprehensive first. Yes. Yeah.
So link to the question by Kevin Wood. For the climate survey report, were the authors able to provide any analysis on the role of domestic media's degrees of freedoms and freedom of expression overall in the country may influence the answer here?
I'm not sure if it is related directly to the media, but we found that the people who are living in I would say very vibrant in terms of their democracy, like the Philippines, Indonesia, they tend to be pessimistic towards their government, and they are more willing to do from their own individual actions. Meanwhile, the countries that are very well developed and the level of trust in their government is very high, like Singapore, and I would say for some extent Vietnam, they tend to trust government to do more for climate change rather than their own individual actions. And in the countries where the democracy is very vibrant, like Indonesia and the Philippines, they have a high trust instead on civil society organizations to do more on climate action rather than government. I think hopefully that can answer the question. Okay.
Thank you very much, Melinda, again. So we move to a question by Sahidu. We are very much concerned about, from the humanistic viewpoint, migration of human beings. Could you put the light on the potential migration of animals world? Where will they find a safe place? Question is for Professor Carl.
Not an easy question to answer. There's another second question about Southeast Asia policies and multi-species justice, which I think also kind of connects to this as well. I think the starting point of thinking about this is to acknowledge that most development policies are anthropocentric. So it's not surprising to find the world of understanding migration as being dominated by a human-centric viewpoint. I know that in academia, like in development studies, including in my own work and like the students, some of the students I'm working with, there's a kind of push towards rethinking that relationship. That there's a kind of an acknowledgement that humans are not center stage of everything. The environment is not the passive stage on which the human drama unfolds, etc., etc. So I'm not really aware of many studies at the moment that address this. I think it's something that should be worked on, but I would just give one perspective on this, that as we move away from an anthropocentric reading of development and start really acknowledging humans' embeddedness in the world around us, it also hints at our deep interconnectedness with non-human life and beyond. So I don't think we need to dichotomously say human and everything else. Actually, supporting life that is non-human to be healthy and vibrant is consistent with human thriving as well. So even like one study that I'm undertaking is about like a human rights-based approach to transboundary water governance on the Mekong, and then extending it to the rights of rivers. And those discussions often take place in different places. Like rights of rivers is kind of pushing for a very like a kind of ecocentric policy approach, but actually a human rights-based approach to having a good livelihood from the river is not inconsistent with a rights of river approach that actually encourages healthy ecosystems in the river. Like they could be consistent. So although this isn't directly answering the question on migration of the animal world, paying attention to this is important, but also not separating humans from everything else is also important, but rather seeing the interconnections for coexistence. And then on the multi-species justice, I think it extends that question. We're not just talking about this in terms of an instrumental human-centric benefit of thriving ecosystems, but actually the right of other living things on the planet to thrive as well alongside humans. So there's a lot to discuss still, and even more to do in practice. But I think this shift in worldview is beginning to emerge, and it's an important one.
Thank you, Carl. I think it's very interesting, right? The fish migration in the Mekong. The Tonle Sap people rely so much on the migration of the fish. If the fish stop migrate, they can't migrate. There's no livelihood either. So it's kind of very connected between animal migration and human livelihood, very direct there in the Tonle Sap, specifically. So the Mekong.
That reminds me. Sorry, just if I could briefly add, because you mentioned migration of fish in the Mekong. At least until a couple of years ago, if you looked in the Mekong River Commission's annual reports on the state of the basin, like they release them every 4 years, they only talked about fish migration, not the human mobility that can connect to the ecosystem. So in other words, like the biocentric understanding of migration is also separated from the human migration as well. Sorry to jump in to add that, but I think it's
yeah, that's very fascinating. I think that's a lot to talk about. Let's move on to the next question by someone anonymous. Please discuss the disaster injustice in which displaced people are further harmed by land grabbers and developers in Southeast Asia. This is for everyone. No specific speaker. Please go ahead. You can jump in if you like the answers or feel like you have something to share.
I can begin if anybody else would like to start.
Yes,
the first thing that comes to my mind with this is Jonathan Riggs' book on kind of rethinking poverty in Southeast Asia. I forget the precise title, but he identified like 4 forms of poverty, of which one of which was the produced poor. So in other words, whilst there's kind of a narrative of Southeast Asia's economic success, in part, that economic success is predicated on some people being produced into poverty because of their loss of access to land and other resources. So I think this kind of dynamic between addressing disasters and mobility and the kind of risks or redistribution of risks that take place are very important to recognize. I also mentioned earlier, there's a paper by Louis Lebel that talks about the risk redistribution of disaster policies rather than the risk reduction of disaster policies. So we see this, for example, in cases of managing flooding. One of the obvious examples is the big flooding in 2011 in Thailand, where areas of central Bangkok were protected at the expense of others who remained flooded. So disaster and justice became a key theme there. I can think of papers that kind of look at the cumulative impacts of disaster and displacement. Like when I mentioned earlier about some of the large hydropower dams that have led to long-term outmigration, I think that kind of connects to this question. That there's first of all not really a recognition that the migration was driven by an underpinning structural violence towards those people, but then in the end it created circumstances of increasingly difficult livelihoods where people are then the communities have to move into new situations of vulnerability where they have less ability to make a livelihood. So I think maybe disaster and justice is something that should be discussed more in academic and policy work in the region. Thanks.
Yeah, I think Melinda, would you like to add on that in terms of is move from disaster to disaster or move from disaster to grabbers, kind of land grab? What, you have any insights on that?
I'm not sure I can answer that question, but I think in Indonesia, I can refer you to a very interesting paper recently published. It's not about climate adaptation, but more on the mitigation side. Actually, providing, social, because the issue surrounding, as I mentioned earlier, if we talk about development issues at large, providing social protection schemes for those who are affected by disasters or other events are not preferable, because as you probably realize that social protection scheme, especially in the form of cash transfer, is highly debated whether it's effective or not. But there is a very interesting paper in Indonesia mentioning that those who receive social cash transfers, the forest community who were involved in illegal lodging and so on, after they receive social cash transfers, the case of illegal lodging in their area, their province, is declining. So actually, it's a question for us, right? Whether we want to use this kind of policy to really tackle environmental issues at large. I hope it can answer to the question.
We have last response. We is running out of time. Mokbul, you have anything to respond to this question in particular about the vulnerability to displacement from climate to land grabbing or violence by development in other areas that they're going to? Have any insights on that?
I will repeat partly what Carl has rightly mentioned, particularly 2011 flooding in Thailand. Because I witnessed myself. I have seen how Thai policymakers tried their best to protect the most important economic areas, economic places where more economic benefits coming to the country. But I think it has to be analyzed how finally it ended up flooding vast areas of farmland and other poor areas where poor were most affected. And I'm sure it has to be analyzed. I'll give another example. The way I'm sorry to say that I don't think there is a very good study which I can talk about, particularly on Nargis, the cyclone in Nargis. I think it has to be analyzed how cyclone Nargis was dealt with, from early warning to immediate relief, and finally long-term reconstruction and relief activities. I'm personally speaking because of my work. I think it could be analyzed how these Nargis affected people finally ended up. I think many of them are beyond Myanmar now, and many of them are struggling in making their livelihood because they could not go back. They could not go back. In any immediate disaster, for example, particularly cyclone, the damage is huge, and at the same time bringing back livelihood, making claim on your assets and everything. But first thing you need is some immediate relief, and then you start your working in the farm or in your on your fish farm, everything. I mean, how do you do that when you first need some documents and everything, and in many cases you struggle with, if there is a inefficient public sector services, you struggle to get those things done without the documents, and these things really become difficult challenges for this vulnerable population. We need to understand those things. I mean, I think my experience is with the public sector people understand that, but I think we need to find out a way how to help those people to make immediate claim on their assets, land, and other things, so that at least they can claim back those things and get back those. Otherwise, I think it will be difficult. And finally, it is not only the document, claim on it, also rebuilding the livelihoods. If it does not happen, I'm sure, as we are discussing today, migration will be more frequent, and it will really affect all of us. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We come to an end, and thank you for the wonderful three speakers, Melinda, Carl, and Mokbul, who share this insightful from the complexity of the definition of migration, climate change migration, to the policy implication and actions. And thank you very much for Southeast Asia University of Hawaii, who offer this opportunity for us to share and talk about it. Please help to fill out the surveys. We like to hear your feedback about the webinar series. So thank you. And that's all for today, and hope to see you in the next conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Have a good one.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.